Thank you very much for joining us. And thank you to our speakers, and I'll hand over to you, Bruno, to kick things off.
Thanks, Sophia. It's a great pleasure to be here. Really a treat to be able to discuss with Adam both our books, but how we think about the present and the future. He was also kind enough to write a blurb for my book, so it's a bit of a family affair here. Now, Adam actually wrote in his Substack this week a very interesting short essay about what it means to write a book about events that are ongoing as you write. You know, you wake up in the morning, you check the news, and you write a section either about that day or about something else, but the two processes happen simultaneously. And that was a challenge for me as well. But I always thought, and maybe Adam will agree with me on this, that it was a good challenge, that it actually was forced you to be very disciplined about your ideas because, you know, they can be refuted immediately. And also forced you to think about time in a very complex way. You were always positioning yourself within the current events, but seeing how they could ramify in the future and testing different possibilities. And I think that's a very helpful way to think about history, probably a better way to think about history, open-ended, than the more traditional way to write history, where you already have pre-made narratives. Many secondary literature books have been written about it. You just use those ideas. And the other reason I thought it was important to try to write a book about current events, well, this was a really big, significant event. We were always very clear about that. And it was important to try to capture the, let us say, events as vividly as you could. Because I think, you know, if you write a book 2 or 3 years after they happen, you lost that sense of reality. You're now thinking in terms of different interpretations, but you lost the natural direct access to the events as they're happening. So I think a book that is written at the same time has a lot of advantages, not just disadvantages. I saw a couple of reviews of Adam's book that expressed skepticism about this. You know, I wouldn't. My discussion is whether it's a better way to write history than, and I'm inclined to think that. Now, you have to come back to the book and to the ideas in the future, I think, to revise, to update, but at least you have material there to work with, and at least you have your reaction to events as they happen. So that is the main challenge. Now, as for the content, and I think maybe Adam will also see himself in this, you have this extraordinary succession of events happening around you, and you're trying to make sense of them, trying to interpret them. I think it's natural that you use some of the categories that are both familiar to you and the ones you have some conviction about. And so in my case, I think it's very obvious in my book that I was working with some classical categories of political thought: the society and nature, the state of nature, how you build a society out of a chaotic state of nature. So I'm a political philosopher by training, and that came very naturally to me. I also had a conviction that this is the right way to think about those events. And if I may kind of make a guess at what Adam was doing, and he'll correct me if I have this wrong, but I think he was doing something similar. I guess we both were trying to find the fundamental contradiction driving the COVID crisis. In my case, the conflict between society and nature. In his case, I see more conflict between markets and state and their respective roles. But again, there's a fundamental contradiction empowering the development. And finally, how does this book fit with my other books? And I'd be curious to hear Adam's opinion about this as well. They are all books, and that's the reason I became a writer. They are all books about how the world is changing. I'm very convinced that we're in the middle of a significant historical change, something that will essentially modify the frameworks we've been familiar with for 100, maybe more years, and all my books are attempts to deal with that. The first one is actually quite modest because I'm discussing the possibility of a multipolar world, the rise of China, the rise of Turkey, the rise of Russia, and that's something rather familiar. Then the third one is an attempt to think about how one of the poles is changing, the fundamental pole, the United States, is changing from within and embracing a post-liberal political culture. And this fourth book is actually more radical in the sense that we've moved beyond the system of states altogether. A new actor has appeared, nature. A new system has developed where the system of states exists against the background of a chaotic natural world. And my conviction was that many of the ways we've been used to think about international relations as an abstract system of states disconnected from an external environment no longer works. And how do we rethink the international system of states now that we have to place it against the background of a renewed, resuscitated nature? Because my impression, even personal impression, is that we're going back to a world where nature was an overpowering actor. The last few centuries have been an exception, and the last few decades, a world where even forgotten about it and thought we had overcome it. So this return of a repressed nature changes everything. In a way, it takes us back to an older world, but also takes us back, and that's kind of the literary gambit in my book. I suggest tentatively that this is the beginning of the space age in a way. Why? Because we're now living in an environment where of an entirely inhospitable nature, living again in the void and having to rebuild a social world in this void. So the titles of the chapters are kind of suggestions of this entry into the space age. The first one, Spaceship Earth, and so on and so forth. That's the summary. I'm very interested to hear Adam's opinions about the challenges of writing in media res.
Oh, that's so fascinating, Bruno, and I'll hand over to Adam now for his thoughts.
Thank you, Sophia. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be talking to Bruno and Sophia at this moment. And there are I do heartily recommend reading the two books in parallel with each other or back to back, because it is, I think, a really fascinating exercise in watching two people. We didn't communicate much with each other except by Twitter in the course of doing this, but attempting to perform quite a similar exercise. And they're very complementary, I think. They're quite different in style, but very complementary. Bruno's book has an extraordinary geographical sweep. He has a globe-trotting kind of horizon that's quite marvelous. If you've not read his reportage from Afghanistan over the last couple of weeks, you've missed out. You should turn to the New Statesman as quickly as possible to catch those pieces. And I would love to hear more in the course of our hour about Bruno's, how that kaleidoscopic event may have changed his impressions yet again. But I heartily agree, and thank you so much, Bruno, for taking the stance that you did on this issue of writing history as we go along. I mean, my position now would be that far from this being banned from all historians, no one ought to get to practice the art of history without doing it at least once. Because it's only when you do it at least once that you experience exactly what Bruno described, this somewhat vertiginous sense that waking up every single morning could change your interpretation in quite a fundamental way, and that taking a stance exposes you to immediate risk, not, as with any scholarly position of humbling at the hands of some distinguished colleague who knows better than you, but simply getting it wrong in a much more direct kind of way. And furthermore, if you write the kind of history that both he and I are interested in, which does center to a degree on politics and business, it brings you into a much closer sympathy with the poor, people who actually have to make decisions on which lives and billions and trillions of dollars hinge every single day, because they are obviously wagering those choices on particular interpretations. So I have become sucked into this. It's not where I started, and I found it completely addictive and preoccupying, and in no way a betrayal of the mission of history, but rather, as Bruno was suggesting, really a kind of actualization of it in an incredibly intense way. And the other thing that, as it were, motivates me very much in line with him is the sense that we are living in a truly dramatic epoch. And I think my way of framing this is very close to his, but in a sense, and very close to Sophia's opening comments as well, that, as it were, we have to place the pandemic within. And then the crucial question is, how do we describe what it is that we're going to place it within? Because Sophia did what I've done, and many other people I've spoken to did, just say bigger, wider, larger things that are going on, like, I don't know, the rise of China, I imagine, or the tech revolution, or the emergence of AI, or whatever. And one of the things I think we have to struggle with is that sense of proportion. I mean, are they larger? Truly larger than something that has disrupted the world in the way that this has, that has caused over 10 million excess deaths by the calculations of The Economist, that caused global GDP to implode by 20% in a matter of weeks in the beginning of 2020, that caused, a total interruption of global mobility, a lockdown that disrupted the education of 1.6 to 1.7 billion people. In fact, a completely unprecedented event in human history. And yet there's something that tempts us, as it's still going on, to our minds wander off to things which are wider, bigger, and I think we have to struggle with that. And I think for me, the book project was part of my struggling with how to locate this shock, which took me completely by surprise. Like many other people of a kind of bien-pensant centre-left disposition, I was obsessed at the beginning of 2020 with the nature problem, exactly the problem that Bruno focuses on. And I was obsessed with, what you might call the old familiars: populism, inequality, global financial instability, rising geopolitical tension. And I had in my mind a kind of vision of how those might be cross-cut with the climate problem. And that was actually the book I was trying to write. And then this thing suddenly comes out of nowhere and just upends my life in a way that nothing ever has before. And struggling with that has really been, for me, and I like Bruno's book for the same reason. They feel like works in progress. They feel like somebody really smart doing their best to try and figure out where we're at. Where I think I have a slight point of difference with Bruno, and it's in a sense a slight point of difference with Sophia as well, is like, so what is this event, right? So in Sophia's, and I'm teasing you because we do it all the time. I can't tell you how many conversations I've been in where somebody will say, well, we've got to figure out how we manage the recovery from the pandemic and the structural problems of, take your pick, the rise of China, Brexit for heaven's sake, or climate change. And it's just like, how big does the event have to be for it to rise to the category of a structural event? Like, compared to Brexit, what we've just been through? I mean, and that ties to a point of difference. And this, Bruno actually takes on an essay that I wrote, thinking in The Guardian in the spring of 2020, because the books are written in kind of dialogue with each other, where I said, and this is more a question of how we locate our current moment in time rather than, as it were, on scale. Like I said, my shtick, in a sense, is I agree with Bruno, this is the first of a new type of problem, but it's a new type of problem which I said was associated with the Anthropocene, which is a concept I would love to hear Bruno more on, but I think there's a degree of skepticism on his part. Because reading Bruno, my sense is it's a sort of, if you'll forgive me, a kind of worldly wise, cosmopolitan Portuguese perspective on the world of globalization, which you folks are the great pioneers of all the way back to the early modern period. So, hey, we've had these problems before. Let me tell you, when we first sailed around the world from our little vantage point, this problem opened up. When the Silk Road opened up, the combination of Marco Polo and the Mongols, these problems started happening. There's nothing new here, really. We are, as Bruno just so elegantly put it, returning back to a period in which nature is boss. And that's our situation. We're going to overcome a kind of modern hubris in this respect. Whereas I think I cleave to what I take to be the far more conventional Anthropocenic or Capitalocene view, which is that, sure, yes, there have been epidemics before. And sure, yes, dynamic conquering empires like the Mongol Empire opened up lines of communication which to change the disease environment in the West. But the difference is the scale, the pace, the intensity of what's coming down the pike and what we're heading into. And so it's not by coincidence that at the same moment that the basic diagnosis of modern Malthusianism was cast in the early 70s with the Club of Rome report, that the so-called emerging infectious diseases paradigm began to gain traction in the virology and epidemiology departments, a kind of counter, an agreement in a sense with Bruno that, conquering smallpox did not mean that we were done with the question of infectious diseases, because we were going to breed some new ones. And in a sense, my reading, I think, is more radically and comprehensively modernist in the sense that I think we're right to worry that these things are going to get larger and larger, come at us faster and faster, that the dynamics are going to be even more aggressive. After all, COVID was pretty mild by the type of diseases one could imagine hitting us. And that is our problem. And we are, and I think Bruno and I fully agree with this, and this is the last comment I'll make, that we're in a kind of arms race between two facets of our existence. And one is, as it were, the risk multiplying facet of our existence, which is absolutely massive. Bruno at one point says, well, Tooze doesn't contemplate the possibility of reducing our consumption of food, which would be, and of dangerous types of food, which would be the ultimate logic of the zoonotic disease syndrome. To which my answer is only because I'm too conservative, but absolutely that's what we should be doing. Clearly we should be. And the climate diagnosis says the same thing. Beef are off the, they're off the menu. They need to be off the menu. On the one hand, and on the other hand, we do have this awesome capacity, which is what 2020 also showed us, for the development of scientific answers or scientific antidotes, something else we didn't really understand. So I think we perhaps somewhat differ in that the atmosphere of Bruno's reading is a sort of return to wisdom, a return to a knowledge, whereas mine is a more perhaps just simply freaked out kind of account of the instability of this modern moment. Neither of us, I think, at any point is advocating a kind of logic of deglobalization or a retreat or that kind of a posture in relation to these. Both of us, and I'm very struck by the convergence of our reading of China in particular, in fact, both of us, I think, are profoundly impressed, indeed awed by the scale of the development in China and its implications. But altogether, it's fascinating to read them side by side, and if I may, I would recommend them both.
Thank you so much, Adam. That's a very worthy response. And I suppose just to come back on your point about how we frame these conversations as bigger, wider, and the significance of the pandemic itself, I think a lot of that discourse is responding to a kind of broader issue in the foreign policy and geopolitical debate space, that around a concern around the idea that we have been too much focused on specific events or specific leaders as kind of deterministic or instrumental in revealing something or shifting the course. There have been plenty of people who wanted to see Donald Trump as an aberration, to see Biden as a correction to the norm, and so on. So I think in some way that highlighting of and this language of something bigger and wider is actually emphasizing that some of these trends have had longer roots, which I think is certainly a point that actually both of you have also made in your other books as well. And I think the other point that it's responding to is probably a sense that a lot of the ways in which individual leaders and ultimately the longer term legacy, the way in which societies have ended up reacting to and behaving within the pandemic and what's been revealed within them in the sort of I was going to say bringing up the bodies, but that's the worst possible terminology to use in this, but the way in which things have been laid bare in many ways, I think so much of that could have been predictable, the inequalities, the sort of ways in which society came together and then pulled apart, and that perhaps one could anticipate some of those things. And I suppose this is a point that we can get to in this discussion is really this question of the legacy of the pandemic specifically, and how we might assess that in time. So there's so many different issues at stake here, and I was wondering whether maybe as a helpful framework we could start talking about governance as one area, and this question about the way in which democracies and autocracies responded to the pandemic, and whether or not that was predictable on both sides, how we can possibly judge performance, and whether there might be any legacies for either that we think will outlast the pandemic itself. So I'll turn to you, Bruno, for thoughts on governance.
I think that's one of the big questions. I was reading Adam's book today, and just telling someone that I love the sections on China because they are extremely objective. none of the Cold War rhetoric, just looking at the facts as they happen. Try to recapture the feeling that we all had back in January, that China was in deep trouble, and then realizing that they came out of it, not losing track of that initial response, and then comparing the response to Western democracies and what happened in Western democracies. Now, I think it was a big test for China, for Xi Jinping, but in some respect, they passed, because what most people thought was that the Chinese regime did not have the levels of efficiency, of state efficiency, state capacity to respond to the problem. And that was the big question mark. And in that area, the response was massive and efficient. And we can discuss about the numbers, but I have many, many friends in China and could see when they went back to normal life, and they did pretty early, and that's indisputable. Now, I do make an effort in the book to be, for lack of a better word, dialectical, in the sense of this massive state response created a number of problems. And I think, I focus on the sense that I suggest in the book that China is almost taking the Enlightenment to its logical conclusion, and all the dystopians of the Enlightenment they find in Frankfurt School are being manifested in China, not in the United States. That human beings are now objectified to the point where they are either tools or they are a threat. And the pandemic inaugurated that point of view, where you are literally a threat to your fellow humans. You are a dangerous beast to your fellow humans. And that, for all the efficiency of the Chinese response, was troubling in the Chinese response. The way you would isolate a baby, a 2-month-old baby, because he had tested positive and he stayed away from his parents for, I think, more than a month after arriving at the airport. We didn't want to do those sort of things in the West. And I think in a kind of self-conscious way, we didn't want it, and we want to pay the price of not doing that. So there's a difficult process here, which I think replicates the historical process we're in the middle of, which is dialectical as well. We don't have China rising and the US falling. We have a process where every movement forward that we see in China creates a response in the US, and every movement in the US creates a response in China. So it's not a linear process. And the same happened with the pandemic. So again, it's very difficult to have a final judgment. But what was striking, that I think Adam captures very well in his book, was, well, we kind of, I actually don't think I suggested that in my own books, but it was common to suggest, that the problem with the Chinese regime was similar with the problem with the Soviet regime, that the state was essentially incapable of responding to social challenges and social problems, that the bureaucracy was disconnected. There was no communicating channel between the public and the leadership. Information did not flow, so you didn't have access to what was happening. On all those dimensions, I think we can be pretty confident in say that those analysts were wrong, and China responded pretty well in those dimensions. This is very significant going forward, because climate change is going to create some of the same problems. And one question that I've been asking is, well, how would the United States have fared during the pandemic without vaccines? Because I think by the point vaccines arrived, it was pretty clear that it was either vaccines or nothing. The United States simply would not be able to respond. It would continue like this for years until perhaps millions had died and there was some kind of natural immunity. And both the American economy and American society would have been hollowed by a very long, difficult process with political conflict. And when it comes to climate change, there isn't any vaccine, because the equivalent to a vaccine, decarbonization, will take many decades to produce its effects. We're now in a process that, in a sense, we're turning around a very heavy oil tanker, and it will take a long time. So it's actually a warning to American society and American leadership. And from that point of view, one actually has to be more optimistic about how societies like China, or like Singapore even more, have reacted to the crisis. Now, final point, I don't quite think that the answer to why some countries in Asia did better is that they are more authoritarian or they have Confucian traditions. I think what we saw is that states that in a certain sense were, what the structures were more recent, they still have a certain flexibility, and they still, and it fits with my general paradigm in the book, they are still in touch with the process of building a state out of nothing. And it's very obvious in Korea, where there are people alive that remember how the Korean state was built essentially out of nothing after the war. And so Taiwan and Korea in particular, vibrant democracies, did have this ability. States that are still either where the modernization process is very recent or they're still in the middle of the modernization process, they showed an ability to respond to this that other states didn't. I think that's the answer, not authoritarianism or Confucianism. And this ties to Adam's point, because it seemed to me, sort of vivid impression during the crisis, that the question in a way was to be more modern, to be more aggressive in the way we deal with nature, to regard nature not as a placid environment, but as a constant threat. And that was the right way to deal with it. That's what I saw in Singapore back at the end of February. And that's what I think China did as well. And so in that sense, my inclination is to say this is not a crisis of the Anthropocene. This is a more traditional crisis where we thought the conquest of nature had finished, but it hasn't, and we have to continue. It's not a process where, as Adam says, we move to a higher level process, a second order process, where it's the consequences of our conquest of nature that are creating problems. I think we're still in the first order process. It just turned out that nature actually has a lot of the characteristics of an actor, of an agent, and that many of the Enlightenment thinkers made a fundamental mistake thinking that nature was inert. So I argue in the book that we have to turn to science fiction to realize that nature is almost at our level in its powers of agency. And so the battle is not the battle against inert matter, it's the battle against a real peer that changes and you know, I don't want to say thinks, although sometimes it does seem that way. And so we're still in the throes of that battle against nature, rather than having moved to the second order process that Ulrich Beck and Adam in his book are concerned with. That's my brief response, Adam. To be continued.
I was thinking while you were talking, I mean, you could almost regard climate change in a way as humans having reintroduced a predator, a lethal predator.
Right.
The image that Bruno Latour likes is the idea that we've, as it were, goaded Gaia to the point that she's lost patience, which,
right.
which has the two elements, right? It's a badly ridden horse. It's a horse that's been driven to fury and is trying to, as it were, cast off this irritating human accompaniment. I think your question, Sophia, is about, you know, governance is crucial. I'll just, you know, briefly add to Bruno's very apt remarks, you know, absolutely concurring that I'm not sure that the best way to think about this is in terms of the distinction democracy versus autocracy. Autocracy in particular, I think, is an unhelpful way of thinking about what China is, because the resilience that the regime showed came from the speed of the reaction, from the willingness to think really rather radical thoughts. One of the most sort of unhelpful preconceptions in the West is that the Chinese regime is in the habit of doing this kind of thing, which is absurd, right? They've never done anything like this. No one had, prior to the Wuhan shutdown a megalopolis of 10 million people full of affluent world travelers. Like, no one had ever attempted to do that before. They were willing to contemplate it and to do it quite quickly. And then what they mobilized, or rather what, as it were, they triggered the mobilization of, was a, not bottom up, right? Because this is not a spontaneous growth of Chinese civil society, but a very carefully engineered, systematically cultivated, resourced network of meso-level, mid-level actors, which, of course, in the Chinese case, given the huge scale of the entity, is the size of a European nation state. If you're talking about a large Chinese province, dozens of cities which are in the world-class level, and then, as it were, the infrastructure of party organizations and committees, which the CCP has been very deliberately in the last 10 to 15 years cultivating, even in the interstices of modern China. So in the fancy new housing estates, there are branches of the CCP. They see the problem of the late Soviet Union coming, and exactly as Bruno said, in the dialectical way, it's integral to their self-understanding of power that they need to avoid that. And they are systematically working at precisely that project. And to that extent, the epidemic reporting system, which they thought was bomb-proof after SARS catastrophically failed, and then after that, the mechanism for, as it were, the fighting the people's war against the virus had a dynamic that we didn't see anywhere in the West. What I think is interesting to think about in the West is, as it were, okay, democracy, yes, but what kind of quality of democracy, in a sense? And this goes to Bruno's point. One way of dating this is in terms of relatively new, relatively old, relatively close to the project of state building. I mean, what I think we have to face up to is, other sorts of rather crass distinction, prone to superstitious nonsense kind of democracies, because evidently democracies can be prone to that kind of populist nonsense. This is one of the possibilities that somebody like Beck emphatically encapsulated in the 1980s. You can come up with all sorts of superstitious silliness in response to a crisis like this, or just flat out denial, or the kind of flu analogy, which again, strikingly, the Chinese never indulge in the flu analogy. But it was very difficult for certain commentators in the West and government officials to lay it aside. So I think it's the quality of democracy that we have to be concerned with. And I think one of the success stories, this is a point I made in a piece in the New York Times last week, is the thing that we should worry about is almost also our success story. If you think about the bit that really did work, it really was governance, not just, as it were, government action, but tight integration between subsidiary branches of the state. I'm thinking about central banks, independent central banks, and financial markets and major actors in the financial markets. And that's one bit of crisis fighting in which the West actually managed to stop the fire, which was burning hard in March, and provide an envelope in which then other things could happen. But one has to ask oneself, I think, why does that bit of governance work comparatively well and other dimensions not work as well at all? To the point where, and this is concurring with Bruno, I completely agree, but for the vaccines, America was going into 2021 in a complete shambles. I mean, the epidemic, if you look at the numbers, peaks in the second peak over the winter. And as a historian who once upon a time used to work on the Third Reich, I can't help finding it disconcerting that we were relying on a miracle weapon. We were relying on a miracle weapon to save us. And how we think about events like Chernobyl or miracle weapons on the other hand, these sorts of hard to calculate certainties, uncertainties about technical modernity is what ought to be one of the disconcerting things. I mean, trying to make that less uncertain in the Keynesian sense, more predictable, more probabilistic, creating a pipeline for those kind of technical fixes, whether we think of the challenge as old in Bruno's sense or new in my sense of anthropocenic, in either case, we need a pipeline and we need to learn how to govern, manage, maximize that pipeline of technical fixes.
We've had a question about, what the West could potentially have learned from China, whether on the pandemic or more broadly. But it does seem to me that one of the challenges in advanced liberal democracies is this conception of who we are as a people. I think a refrain that was very common in Britain, and I'm sure in the United States as well throughout the pandemic, was, oh, well, we can't do that. We couldn't impose that because we're not like that. We're not like those people. It's still going on. We can't have vaccine passports like they do in France, because we're freedom-loving people, and these parts of the character that feel intrinsic or how they're interpreted by our political leaders, who, of course, as we well know, are not always a kind of very accurate distillation. Representative democracy does not necessarily give us a representative cross-section of society. Do you see that actually, that the burden of the legacy of a strong sense of national identity and it being resilient and fixed and perhaps less adaptive, does that become a weakness moving into the 21st century?
I suspect that's what Adam means by a number of superstitions that he was talking about, among other examples. But when you have a regime that is so much under the thrall of certain ideas that are never explained, they are very abstract, and that prevents the regime or the political system from responding to a really catastrophic crisis. I think the response is not to say the ideas are precious. The response is to say, well, this is actually not what we learn from Enlightenment thought. You have to adapt to your circumstances. You have to be able to self-criticize. You have to be able to question. And by the way, in the end, you ended up questioning and criticizing that, but under pressure, or in fact, those ideas ended up collapsing rather than being revised. So a sacrifice of agency, because you wait for the moment when, in fact, it's a natural process that forces you to move ahead. That, I think, was very typical of the response in the West. If we actually ended up being right, so Adam in his book has some passages where, at the beginning in February, Boris Johnson, among many others, is saying, we don't really need to do this. We have to move slowly. This is going to be a long fight. We have to move slowly. If that judgment had been vindicated by the facts, then you could say, well, this shows the resilience of certain ideas of national identity. But what happened is all that quickly was abandoned, but abandoned too late and under pressure from circumstances. So I don't think it was a very good picture, and in fact, so showed a certain rigidity of thought that not only goes against some of our ways of understanding ourselves, our self-image, but doesn't bode very well for the future. And for the many, on this, Adam and I agree entirely, on the many crises similar to this and worse than this that are coming around. And there's a question, I think it's a good one, of whether we've learned anything, whether China has learned anything, but also whether we have learned anything. We're in better shape. And maybe it's my pessimistic streak, but I'm not quite sure. There are many passages in the two books that come extremely close, and so one idea that we're both very interested in, and you have almost similar passages, is the reaction in the West when events started to transpire in China was essentially, this cannot happen here.
Chernobyl.
This is inconceivable here, and this should be a moment to think that we are thinking about the world in wrong terms, in a deeply misguided way, because we actually had a warning. And it was curious because the people who started to panic around the end of January were the people that are actually quite familiar with China. There were two groups: the Silicon Valley people, because they have been waiting for a catastrophe and preparing for it, and also people that know China very well, because people who know China well and saw the decision to close down Wuhan. I mean, this is a moment when all, as Adam says, all red lights should have gone on, but nothing of that happened. So there's a crisis not only of policy but of thought that I think this revealed.
It's not so much, in other words, to put exactly the same point slightly differently, it's not so much learning from China as finally waking up to the fact that we share a world with it, like properly share a world with it. We are in the same world as China. So exactly as Bruno says, that when something utterly staggering happens in a huge provincial city in China, to imagine it doesn't concern us is, as it were, just not actually being in the present that we're in, right? It's actually because we talk endlessly about globalization and what it means. And in the same way in 2008, like the Europeans convinced themselves that what was going on with the Lehman crisis had nothing to do with Deutsche Bank. And Deutsche Bank has spent the rest of a decade trying to recover from what happened in 2008, effectively, allow the simplification. There's a way in which we still, as it were, constantly trot out this rhetoric of globalization and yet are not actually able to contemplate. And it's staggering. And I'm not saying it's easy, but the smart thing to have done would have been to impose very dramatic restrictions and track and trace on all global air travel immediately. And now that doesn't strike us as weird at all because we live it as a reality. And I know Bruno has tweeted about the horrors of trying to do his cosmopolitan lifestyle under current conditions. But in February 2020, it would have been absolutely the wise and prudent thing to do. And it was unthinkable. And I think we need to go. I totally take your point, Sophia, about like national stereotypes. And it's, of course, incredibly tempting for somebody of a left-wing disposition to hammer on about the inanities of Trump and Boris Johnson, and to trot out the kind of line that, you know, reality has a liberal bias or whatever. But in fact, if you do, this is an area where thinking about history is really interesting. This is a structural dilemma, right? A large part of the global public health regime is in fact designed specifically to prevent trigger-happy, moral panic-driven responses to epidemics in faraway Asian places, right? That is literally its origin in the 19th century. On the one hand, to police epidemics coming, as Bruno insists, across Eurasia, to police the impact of the Hajj, the very large movement of the Muslim population around the Indian Ocean, on the global disease environment, and to square that with the principles of liberal free trade. That is, in fact, what almost all of the early health treaties are about. And the WHO carries that in its DNA, because there are two types of mistake you can make as a WHO official. One is to not call a crisis, which is what they've been accused of now. And the other one is to prematurely call a crisis and to shut down global air travel. And this unleashes a spiral of dilemmas. So even if you're not cursed with some sort of insane idea that British people have to be able to go to the pub, you know, and that some sort of the rights of freeborn Englishmen are infringed if they can't do that. Even if you're not, if you're just focused on the structural necessities of managing a modern world, this dilemma has insistently posed itself. And the most telling thing telling remark that Johnson made was not so much about the pubs, but about his sympathy for the mayor in the famous Jaws film, who's all about trying to keep the tourist traffic to the beach open despite the arrival of this man-eating or woman-eating monster, right? That's a closer kind of problem. And that's, I think, you don't have to be clouded by superstitious ideas to recognize the incredibly painful trade-offs that act there. And Bruno has a brilliant line in the book where he says, what was challenged in 2020 was not capitalism as such, but the idea of capitalism as supervening over everything, right? This sort of icon of capitalism that cannot be infringed. What we actually learned was that if you want to maintain the tourist business in general, it's a terrible idea to acquire the reputation for being slap happy about shark hazards, right? In the long run, it's an absolutely terrible strategy. And in a sense, that's the wisdom of the Chinese move, is go early, go hard, shut everything down, make your problem the problem of how to restart, not your problem of dealing with, you know, a protracted, endless lockdown.
Although that too poses its own problems. I mean, I do think if you look at I suppose actually to go back to this question about autocracies versus democracies being a rather unhelpful framing. I mean, if you think about democracies like Australia that have taken a frankly illiberal approach in many ways and shutting off the borders completely and denying repatriation to their citizens. I mean, I think, you know, it's hard to draw a clear line. And I think that one of the legacies that they're facing with this question of restarting is how do you psychologically re-prepare and recondition your citizens to accept let alone desire an open and connected world. And I mean, I think there are questions about whether or not we can feel it is a coincidence that after a decade of incredibly intensive conversations in advanced democracies about demography and immigration and, you know, cultural change and social change, that we end up having a pandemic that sort of in many ways intensifies and pushes those questions. I mean, how confident do we feel? And I think we could bring this into a way of talking about some of the legacies of the pandemic. I mean, how confident do we think that many of the sort of more miserable, poorly functioning, socially disconnected, unequal, discriminatory, poor outcome sort of aspects of our societies and our frameworks of governance and democracies that have been revealed in the pandemic? I mean, how confident do we feel that they will be addressed, or will there be a sense of sort of just pushing forward to a kind of recovery, and actually the recovery is getting back to where we were before, carrying all these problems along with us?
Right. So I I start in the book. I start my discussion of that question referring to Kafka's Metamorphoses, because I always very amused the way it starts. He's transformed into this large bug, but then everything is very normal. Someone knocks at the door. Why aren't you going to your job in the morning? Are you catching the early train or are you catching the later train? And I saw something of this in the first year of the pandemic. I remember I was in a discussion with Adam where we talked about this, that, in Europe, we're talking about the same topics as we were in 2019. In the US, it was all about January 6th, not the pandemic. But I've become slightly less cynical about this. I do see a changed political landscape, as you would expect. I think you would expect it, and I see it. There are ideas that were difficult to defend before, and now they are openly defended. And I think the Biden presidency does represent that to some extent, but a little bit all over the world. Now, I don't think this is a crisis of capitalism, but it is a redirection of capitalism. In my framework is a redirection of capitalism towards the external environment and how it can be mastered and conquered. In Adam's terms, it would be a different redirection. But there's maybe a slight disagreement in the way we think about this, because, or maybe not, but I see very little of the old debate, so to say left and right. I see very little, for example, in the way capitalism is being rethought today in 2021, very little about class. And when I see Joe Biden speaking, it's all about mastery and particularly competition against China. And that's why we're going to have an infrastructure plan. But very little about social equity, very little about class. It does seem to be a different discussion from the post-war debate about the relative role of state and markets. I don't see the same debate returning. There are elements of it, but it seems to me that it's fundamentally different. We have entered an age of an environmental crisis, and capitalism has to be refit for that. I don't think we are entering an age of a new socialism, to put it very briefly, because we're running out of time. Let me see what Adam thinks about that.
I mean, the reason why we can't is what has happened over the last half century, right? So one of the things I do take aim at in the book is the sort of ahistorical quality of the talk about a new social contract, and the really heavily recurrent references to the period of the New Deal or the great post-war welfare states, because those were founded on societies in which, as Bruno says, class conflict was absolutely paramount everywhere in the advanced economies, whether you're talking about Japan or the United States or Europe. And those welfare states and those social contracts were compromised products of real hard power, you might almost say, class relations between massively organized trade unions on the one hand and rather well organized, largely national or indeed imperial capital on the other. And that is not our world. And we have, the last 50 years of what is, take your pick, the market revolution, neoliberalism has fundamentally changed that world. And so whatever happens now takes place in the context of a world reshaped. I think I disagree with Bruno on the salience of inequality and class in the US. I mean, this, I think, is the first administration ever to formulate as the bedrock of its foreign policy doctrine the principle that American foreign policy is for the middle class. And folks like Jake Sullivan, who I know Bruno follows very closely as to get a kind of read on Biden's foreign policy, literally spent time in, while they were furloughed under Trump, working with the Carnegie Council to do inquiries with, I think, Nebraska, Ohio, somewhere else, one of the other, as it were, middle American states on the priorities for foreign policy. And frankly, I think that's one way of reading what's happening in Afghanistan. So I think there is, in fact, quite a fundamental reorientation there. How lasting it will be and how enduring it can be, given that underlying and historic shift in class relations, which is very different depending on where you are. And the perspective of Portugal is, in fact, I think, quite radically different from that of the United States, as it is from that of the UK or China or Russia or wherever else we might look. But certainly in the US, there's a sort of revival of that concern, but to reiterate, if you like, without the power configuration. So this discourse of inequality is the preoccupation of woke is the shorthand, but that doesn't really do it justice. A much more encompassing group trying to reconfigure the Democratic Party's coalition of government, which Bill Clinton reconfigured in the 1990s, And they're doing it up against the GOP, which is in the business, I think we have to understand it, the crisis of the GOP as a world historic force, to be honest, in its implications, trying to configure American politics and American society in a radically different way. And where to look to see that and its ongoing force is not in Washington right now, but in Texas, where the battle lines are being drawn on the bodies of women in Texas, on the voting rights of minorities, and a reconfiguration of American polity and society is underway. So both major contenders for power have social visions of the US. One of them is very preoccupied with inequality. Neither of them, however, is operating in the space that the classic New Deal era politics was.
Yeah, this question of how you bring foreign policy into a domestic space and sensitive to that is something we've been doing a lot of work on at BFPG and looking at how you merge leveling up and global Britain in a kind of coherent way, which I think is feasible, but will obviously take a huge investment of political will and a fundamental rethink of the foreign policy community's role as, in terms of its interactions with citizens. Just to finish, because we're nearly out of time, we've had another question about climate change and the real world impacts, and maybe let's use that as a springboard for some final thoughts about, we've had this event that was shocking, that took a long time for many nations to mobilize against. We've talked a little bit about climate change. What are the other big issues that we can see on the horizon that we should be preparing for now?
Adam, do you want to go first?
Well, I think what I think the pandemic taught us is to think of this challenge, and I insist on thinking it, unlike Bruno, as a kind of modern challenge. But maybe we can square the difference on this, Gaia that we've driven mad with our impish violence. We need to understand it more broadly, right? So, and that is what environmentalists have been telling us for a long time. In a sense, we've become monomaniacally fixated on climate because it's so dramatic. But our problem is, in fact, multi-pronged and moving at very different speeds. And so, I mean, if you pushed me, I would say that, as it were, the zoonotic mutation is the flip side of biodiversity loss. And they're two parts of a ruinous package of anthropocenically induced change. Desertification and pollution are the others. The just massive destruction of the ocean environment through the huge and very recent and very dynamically growing consumption of plastics in emerging Asia. If you look at where the plastic pollution of the world's oceans is coming from, the Indian Ocean is at the absolute heart of this. So this is where, as it were, both Bruno and I shared a conception, I think, of the shifting balance merges. The climate problem, I think, also overwhelmingly is an Asian problem. That's where the impacts will be worst, and that's where the solutions have to come from. So that would be my nomination.
Well, I entirely agree. I think 2021 has been already the year where all these problems have become very visible. We've moved seamlessly from the pandemic to the climate emergency, and as Adam says, many of these consequences are going to be rather indirect. They're going to look like something we didn't think climate change was about. So if there's a flood and a major port has to be closed for a year, the root cause is the climate, but the problem is going to be a problem about supply chains, antibiotic resistance, new pandemics, and so on and so forth. But we're going to be dealing with this inevitably. We already are. And one of the premises of my book is that even the competition between major powers has to be understood in this context. To some extent, it's going to be about, just as the pandemic was, who deals with climate change better, who's able to respond. That's how in my view, how the competition between China and the US is ultimately going to be decided, not through a war.
Indeed, and I suppose even, looking at the events recently in Afghanistan, I mean, it strikes me that these questions about the projection of our values, we're still applying a framework that perhaps is drawing attention and resources away from areas where we could actually project and instill our values, such as new frameworks of governance around ethical AI and other sort of new frontiers. But that's all for another day. I will let you both go. It's just been so wonderful to have you, both Bruno and Adam, and we will send around links as well for where your books can be purchased. Thank you very much to both of you for giving up your time to join us here, and thank you to the audience as well. I should just flag that we are going to be publishing a new report hopefully next week on resetting UK-China relations. So please look out for that. But until then, thank you very much, Bruno. Thank you, Adam. Thank you to the audience. And we'll see you all soon at the British Foreign Policy Group. Thank you.